The city was alive with its usual chaos, honking cars, crowded streets, and the distant hum of police sirens. Among the sea of people was a cop who had long forgotten why he wore the badge. He wasn't just any cop, he was one of the rotten ones, the kind who took bribes, bullied the weak, and thought he was untouchable. That afternoon, he was in a particularly foul mood. A deal had gone wrong, money was missing, and his temper was on a short fuse. As he patrolled the streets, his eyes scanned for an easy target to take his anger out on. That's when he spotted a car parked just a little too close to a no-parking zone. Perfect. He strutted over, his boots clicking against the pavement, and banged his fist on the window. License and registration. Now. The driver, a middle-aged man in a simple shirt, looked up calmly. There was something about his quiet confidence that irked the cop even more. The man reached for his glove compartment, but the cop was impatient. Too slow, he barked, yanking the door open. Before the driver could react, the cop grabbed him by the collar and slapped him hard across the face. The sound echoed in the street, and a few bystanders gasped. The driver didn't flinch. He just touched his stinging cheek and looked the cop dead in the eye. "That was a mistake," he said softly. The cop laughed. "Oh yeah? And what are you gonna do about it, old man?" The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small badge, a judge's badge. The cop's blood ran cold. This wasn't just any judge, this was the one known for being ruthless with corrupt officials. The judge didn't raise his voice. He just smiled, a smile that sent chills down the cop's spine. "Let's see how untouchable you really are." And just like that, the cop's world began to crumble. Part 2 of 8, next 1500 words. The cop's bravado vanished in an instant. His throat went dry as the judge pulled out his phone and dialed a number. Within minutes, sirens wailed in the distance, different from the usual city noise. These were the sounds of internal affairs, the people who policed the police. The cop tried to backtrack. "Look, Your Honor, this is just a misunderstanding." The judge cut him off. "Save it for the investigation." His voice was ice. The bystanders, who had been silent witnesses, now whispered among themselves. Some pulled out their phones, recording the scene. The cop's face burned with humiliation. He had bullied people for years, thinking no one would ever stand up to him. Now, the whole street was watching his downfall. When internal affairs arrived, they didn't even look at him with anger, just disappointment. One of them, a senior officer, shook his head. "We've been watching you for a while. This was just the last straw." As they cuffed him, the cop realized this wasn't just about slapping a judge. This was about every bribe he'd taken, every innocent person he'd framed, every time he'd abused his power. The judge hadn't just reacted to the slap, he had set a trap, and the cop had walked right into it. The ride to the station was silent. For the first time in years, the cop felt fear. Not the fear he instilled in others, but the kind that comes when you know there's no way out. Meanwhile, the judge sat in his car, rubbing his cheek where the slap had landed. He wasn't done yet. This was just the beginning. The cop's hands trembled as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. The cold metal bit into his skin, a harsh reminder that this wasn't some intimidation tactic, this was real. He was under arrest. His mind raced, scrambling for excuses, for a way out, but the judge's calm, unwavering stare told him there was none. Internal affairs officers surrounded him, their expressions unreadable. One of them, a grizzled veteran with a scar above his eyebrow, leaned in slightly. "You really messed up this time," he muttered, just loud enough for the cop to hear. The street was now packed with onlookers. Phones were raised, recording every second of his humiliation. A few people in the crowd whispered, some in shock, others in satisfaction. The cop had terrorized this neighborhood for years, and now, karma had come knocking. As they led him to the unmarked car, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window. His face was pale, his usual swagger gone. For the first time in his career, he wasn't the one in control. The interrogation room. The station was different when you were on the wrong side of the table. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows. The cop sat in the interrogation room, the same one where he had once smirked at suspects, confident in his power. Now, the roles were reversed. The door opened, and two internal affairs detectives walked in. One was the scarred veteran from earlier, the other was a younger woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing. They didn't bother with small talk. "You've got a lot to answer for," the woman said, sliding a file across the table. The cop scoffed, trying to regain some of his old arrogance. "This is over a slap." "Really? Since when does a judge get special treatment?" The veteran detective chuckled darkly. "Oh, this isn't just about the slap." He flipped open the file, revealing photos, bank statements, and witness testimonies. "This is about everything." The cop's stomach dropped. They knew. The evidence piles up. The detectives didn't need to rough him up or scream in his face. They just laid out the facts, one by one, like bricks building a prison around him. The bribes, security footage from a local diner showed him accepting envelopes of cash from a known crime boss. The framed cases, witnesses, people he had bullied into silence, were now coming forward, ready to testify. The missing money, unexplained deposits in his bank account, far beyond his salary. The cop's throat tightened. He had thought he was careful. He had thought he was untouchable. But the judge hadn't acted on impulse. He had been waiting for this moment. The judge's move. Meanwhile, in his office, the judge sipped his coffee, reviewing the case files. His cheek still stung, but the satisfaction of seeing the cop squirm made up for it. His assistant, a young man fresh out of law school, hesitated before speaking. "Sir, are we pushing this too far? I mean, it was just a slap." The judge set down his cup. "No. It was never just a slap." He tapped the files. "This man has been terrorizing people for years. He thought he was above the law. Today, he learned he wasn't." The cop's desperation. Back in the interrogation room, the cop's bravado was crumbling. "I want a lawyer," he demanded, his voice cracking. The female detective smirked. "Already called one. But here's the thing, your usual guys? They're not returning your calls." The cop's blood ran cold. His so-called connections, the people who had always covered for him, were cutting him loose. He was alone. The media storm. By evening, the news had spread like wildfire. Corrupt cop assaults judge, full investigation underway. The headlines were brutal. The public, tired of police corruption, erupted in outrage. Protests formed outside the precinct. Politicians demanded reforms. The department, scrambling to save face, issued a statement: "We do not tolerate misconduct. This officer will face the full extent of the law." The cop, now locked in a holding cell, watched the news on a small TV. His face was everywhere. His career was over. His life was over. And the worst part? This was only the beginning. The holding cell smelled like sweat and stale coffee. The cop sat on the hard bench, his head in his hands. The muffled sounds of the station, phones ringing, officers chatting, the occasional burst of laughter, felt like they were miles away. He was trapped in his own crumbling world. A guard rapped on the bars. "Your lawyer's here." The cop looked up, hope flickering for a second, until he saw who it was. Not his usual slick, high-priced fixer. This was a tired-looking public defender, a woman with messy hair and a stack of files under her arm. She didn't even bother with a greeting. "They're throwing the book at you," she said flatly, sitting across from him. Assault on a judicial officer, bribery, evidence tampering, coercion, the list goes on. The cop clenched his fists. This is bullshit. They can't prove half of that. The lawyer sighed, flipping open a file. They have video. Witnesses. Paper trails. Your own partner is testifying against you. That hit him like a punch to the gut. His partner? The guy he'd covered for a dozen times? She leaned in. Here's the reality, you're going down. The only question is how hard you hit the ground. The partner's betrayal. Across town, in a quiet bar, the cop's former partner sat across from an internal affairs detective, nursing a drink. His hands weren't steady. I didn't sign up for this, he muttered. The bribes, the threats, it was supposed to be small stuff. But he kept pushing. The detective slid a photo across the table, a young kid, barely out of high school, sitting in a jail cell. This kid spent 6 months locked up because your partner planted evidence. You knew. You said nothing. The partner's face twisted with guilt. I'm saying something now. The judge's next move. The judge wasn't celebrating. He sat in his study, reviewing case files late into the night. His wife peeked in, concerned. You've been at this for hours, she said softly. He rubbed his tired eyes. This isn't just about one bad cop. It's about the whole system that let him thrive. She hesitated. You think you can change that? He looked at the files, decades of complaints buried, investigations shut down, good cops forced out. I have to try. The cop's breaking point. Back in the cell, the cop paced like a caged animal. His mind raced, who else would turn on him? How much did they really know? Then it hit him. The storage unit. He had stashed evidence there, records, money, things that could burn his enemies if he went down. If he could get to it, he might still have leverage. But how? He was locked up, and his so-called friends had vanished. Then he remembered her. The wild card. The cop's ex-girlfriend hadn't spoken to him in years, not since he'd gotten violent during an argument. But she was the only one who knew about the storage unit. And she owed him nothing. Still, desperate times called for desperate measures. He convinced his lawyer to pass a message, tell her I'll give her half of what's in there if she helps me. The lawyer looked skeptical. You really think she'll bite? The cop's smile was grim. Everyone has a price. The setup. The ex-girlfriend got the message. She stood in her kitchen, staring at the note, her hands shaking. Not from fear, from anger. She picked up her phone and dialed a number. Not the lawyer's. The judge's. I think you'll want to hear this, she said. The trap closes. 2 days later, under heavy guard, the cop was transferred to a different facility. As the armored van rolled through the city, he stared out the barred window, plotting his next move. What he didn't know. His ex had given the judge the storage unit key. And inside wasn't just evidence against him, it was evidence against everyone who had protected him. The dominoes were about to fall. The storage unit smelled of dust and stale air when the judge and 2 federal agents pushed open the rusted metal door. A single hanging bulb flickered to life, revealing stacks of plastic bins and a dented filing cabinet in the corner. The younger agent whistled. This guy really kept receipts, huh? The judge didn't smile. He crossed the concrete floor in 3 strides and yanked open the filing cabinet. Inside weren't just documents, there were ledgers, USB drives, and a black leather notebook with names, dates, and amounts scrawled in tight, paranoid handwriting. The second agent flipped through a ledger and went very still. Sir, this isn't just about bribes. This implicates half the precinct. And the deputy mayor's office. The judge's fingers tightened around the notebook. He'd expected dirt. Not an atomic bomb. The cop's last hope crumbles. The cop sat in the prison common area, pretending to watch a grainy TV while straining to hear the muttered conversations around him. Inmates had been giving him wider berth all day. That's when he knew, word had leaked. A wiry man with tattooed knuckles slid onto the bench beside him. "Heard you got a storage problem," he murmured. The cop's stomach dropped. "What's it to you?" The man smirked. "Nothing. But the guys you owe money to? They real interested." He stood, patting the cop's shoulder too hard. "Sleep light, officer." For the first time in his life, the cop felt true, primal fear. His leverage was gone. And the wolves were circling. The dominoes began to fall. By noon the next day, 3 high-ranking officers abruptly took personal leave. A city councilman held a tearful press conference about prioritizing family. The deputy mayor's lawyer was spotted sprinting into the courthouse. The judge watched the chaos unfold from his office window, sipping black coffee. His assistant burst in, waving a tablet. "Sir, the DA just announced a special task force to review all cases tied to the implicated officers." The judge allowed himself one small, satisfied nod. This wasn't just about punishment anymore. It was about unraveling years of rot. A desperate play. The cop's lawyer arrived looking like she'd aged a decade overnight. "They're adding RICO charges," she said without preamble. "That means decades in prison." The cop's voice came out strangled. "I need a deal." "You've got nothing to trade," she snapped. Then, quieter, "unless you know where the bodies are buried." Literally. A memory flashed, a rainy night, a nervous informant, a shallow grave behind an abandoned factory. The cop swallowed bile. "Get me immunity." The lawyer's look was pure pity. "You don't get it. The judge doesn't want deals. He wants justice." The unexpected visitor. That evening, the cop received a visitor, not his lawyer, not internal affairs. His mother. She sat across from him in the visitation room, her Sunday church dress neatly pressed, her hands folded. She didn't cry. Just stared at him with an expression he hadn't seen since he was 16 and brought home a stolen bike. "Ma," he croaked. She cut him off. "I prayed you'd get caught." The words gutted him. "Not to punish you," she continued softly. "To save you." She pushed a Bible across the table. "Start here." When she left, the cop didn't open the book. Just sat there, hollowed out, as the guard muttered, 5 more minutes. The judge's dilemma. Across town, the judge sat across from the police commissioner, the storage unit evidence spread between them. The commissioner's hands shook as he touched a photo, a young rookie cop, bright-eyed, standing beside the now disgraced officer. "That's my nephew," the commissioner said hoarsely. "He quit the force last year. Said he couldn't take the corruption." The judge leaned forward. "Help me clean this up. Or more families get destroyed." For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the office clock. Then the commissioner reached for his pen. The first resignation. By midnight. The deputy mayor retired effective immediately. 7 officers were suspended without pay. A notorious crime boss turned himself in, claiming he wanted to clear his conscience. The cop watched the news reports from his cell, numb. He'd spent years building this empire of fear. It had taken the judge 3 days to burn it to the ground. The cell intercom crackled. "Inmate 47821, pack your things. You're being transferred to county lockup for arraignment." As he stood, his mother's Bible slid off the bunk. It fell open to a highlighted verse. "For what shall it profit a man, if he shall gain the whole world, and lose his own soul?" The cop left it lying there. The courtroom buzzed like a hornet's nest as the cop was led in, shackles clinking around his ankles. Reporters packed the back rows, sketching his hollowed-out face for the evening news. But it was the front row that made his breath hitch, the victims. A gaunt man with a scarred lip, arrested on fake drug charges. A teenage girl clutching her mother's hand, her brother was still in prison because of planted evidence. An elderly shopkeeper, beaten during an interrogation. Their stares burned into him. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. For a heartbeat, their eyes met, the cops pleading, the judges unreadable. Then the gavel cracked. Case number 1147, the bailiff announced. The People versus. A scream cut through the room. You remember me? A wild-eyed man lunged from the crowd, swinging a metal cane at the cop's head. Chaos in the court. Bailiffs tackled the attacker as the cane grazed the cop's temple, drawing blood. The judge roared for order while the cop crouched like a cornered animal, tasting copper. The attacker spat as they dragged him out. 6 years in prison because of your lies. My daughter died while I was inside. The cop wiped blood from his eyebrow. His hands shook. He'd forgotten this man's name, just another name on a falsified arrest report. The judge watched him closely. No sympathy. Just a silent question, now do you understand? The testimony that shattered him. One by one, witnesses took the stand. The single mother, he said he'd arrest me for prostitution if I didn't pay him $500 a month. I'm a waitress. The junkie informant, I lied on the stand because he promised me clean needles. Got 3 people sent up for life. The widow, slides a photo of her husband across the stand. Hung himself in jail after this man framed him. Left a note saying, I can't take the injustice. The cop kept his head down, scratching at his cuffs until his wrists bled. The judge noticed. Said nothing. The judge's secret move. During recess, the judge met privately with the prosecutor. Offer him a deal, he said. The prosecutor gaped. After today's testimony? The public will riot. The judge handed him a file. Inside, medical records showing the cop's mother was stage 4 pancreatic. 20 years instead of life. On one condition, he names every dirty official, every buried crime, every cent of dirty money. Starting now. When the cop heard the offer, he laughed until he choked. That's it? After all this, you're cutting me slack. The prosecutor leaned in. He said to tell you, mercy isn't weakness. It's the one thing you never showed. The cop's laughter died. The visit that changed everything. That night, the cop's mother was wheeled into the visitation room, oxygen tank hissing. She looked smaller. Frilier. He pressed his forehead to the glass. Ma, I'm gonna take the deal. I'll tell them everything. She didn't smile. Just reached into her purse and slid a photograph under the divider. A toddler in a Christmas sweater. Your niece. Born while you were extorting money. She thinks cops are heroes. The cop's vision blurred. His mother stood shakily, leaning on the wheelchair. Fix what you can. The list begins. At dawn, the cop sat across from 2 federal agents, a tape recorder between them. Start with the biggest name, an agent said. The cop took a shaky breath. Commissioner Hayes took 10% of every bribe. Evidence locker #12B has the proof. The agents exchanged glances. Hayes wasn't just powerful, he was the judge's mentor. One agent whispered, does the judge know what's coming? The cop wiped his palms on his jumpsuit. He's the one who asked for the truth. The judge's choice. By noon, the scandal reached the judge's chambers. His mentor, the man who'd sworn him in, was arrested on live TV. His assistant burst in, pale. Sir, your wife's online too. Reporters are camped outside your house. The judge stared at the arrest footage. He'd wanted justice. But this? This felt like cutting off his own arm. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Now you know what it costs. The cop. The judge deleted it. Then poured himself the first drink he'd had in 15 years. The city erupted overnight. Protesters flooded the streets, their chants shaking the courthouse windows, "No justice, no peace," and "Clean house now." News helicopters circled like vultures as the police commissioner, handcuffed, his suit rumpled, was perp-walked past his own officers. Inside the precinct, detectives stared at their coffee, shell-shocked. One muttered, "Who's left to trust?" The cop watched it all from a secure FBI holding room, a half-eaten sandwich forgotten in front of him. The federal agent monitoring him glanced up from his notes. "You realize you just lit a fuse on a powder keg, right?" The cop rubbed his raw wrists. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like lying. "Yeah. And it's about damn time." The judge's house under siege. The judge's suburban home, once a quiet refuge, was now a fortress. News vans clogged the street. Protesters waved signs reading, "Judge or hypocrite." His teenage daughter peered through blinds upstairs, her phone blowing up with texts, "Is your dad a hero or a traitor?" His wife slammed the bedroom door behind her. "They're saying you knew about Hayes for years. That this was all for politics." The judge yanked off his tie, his voice fraying. "I didn't know. But I should've." A rock suddenly smashed through the living room window. Glass rained onto the hardwood as screams erupted downstairs. The judge grabbed his wife's arm. "Get the kids to the basement. Now." The cop's dangerous truth. Back at FBI headquarters, the cop was mid-confession when he dropped the bomb. "There's a body." The interrogator's pen froze. "Excuse me?" The cop's throat worked like he was swallowing razors. 2 years ago. A kid, just some college student, saw me take a payoff behind the precinct. My partner panicked. Shoved him. His head hit the curb. He looked up, eyes bloodshot. We buried him under the new condos on 12th. The room went dead silent. The interrogator slowly set down his coffee. "That project was funded by the deputy mayor's brother." The cop nodded. The FBI agent swore and reached for his phone. The widow's vengeance. The judge didn't expect visitors at midnight, especially not the gaunt woman who testified earlier about her dead husband. She stood on his porch, clutching a manila envelope, her voice shaking with rage. "My husband's case file. Your mentor buried it. Now I want to know, were you part of that too?" The judge took the file. Inside, doctored evidence, a judge's signature that wasn't his, but close enough to raise questions. His stomach turned. "I'll reopen the case. Personally." She laughed bitterly. "And then what? Another deal? Another apology?" A tear cut through the dirt on her cheek. "My kids ask why Daddy's in the ground instead of the man who put him there." The porch light flickered as she walked away, leaving the judge holding the weight of his own broken system. The cop's bargain turned sour. The cop thought his cooperation would buy safety. He was wrong. As guards escorted him through the prison transfer corridor, a shadow moved in an alcove. A familiar face, his old partner's new partner. The man pressed something cold into his palm and whispered, "Hayes says you talk anymore, your mom's hospice gets a visit." The cop looked down. A single bullet. When the guards weren't looking, he flushed it down a toilet, hands shaking. His deal with the judge had just become a death sentence, for him and his family. The judge's breaking point. 3 a.m. The judge sat at his kitchen table, the widow's file spread beside his untouched whiskey. His daughter's footsteps creaked on the stairs. "Dad? I can't sleep." He quickly covered the crime scene photos. "I know, baby. It'll stop." Her voice was harder than he'd ever heard. I'm not 5. Tell me the truth, did you really not know? The question hung between them. The judge thought of Hayes laughing at his daughter's graduation, slipping her $100 bills. The way he'd always said, we look out for our own. He reached for her hand. I didn't see because I didn't want to see. She pulled away, tears glittering. That's worse. The point of no return. At dawn, 2 events happened simultaneously. The FBI dug up the construction site, cameras rolling, revealing a skeleton in a rotted college sweatshirt. The judge held a press conference, announcing he was stepping down to fully assist the investigation, no matter where it leads. Watching from separate cells, the cop and his former partner had the same thought, it's over. But they were wrong. The riot outside the courthouse that afternoon wasn't just about corruption anymore. It was about every broken promise, every rigged system, every life crushed under the weight of the way things are. And as the first Molotov cocktail shattered against the precinct doors, one truth became undeniable. No one was walking away clean. The city burned in slow motion. Acrid smoke curled over downtown as protesters clashed with riot police. A news helicopter captured the surreal scene, flames licking up the courthouse steps, the same building where the judge had presided for a decade. Inside his now abandoned chambers, an ember caught on a stack of case files, devouring years of verdicts in seconds. The judge watched it live on a diner's greasy TV, his family hidden in a motel under fake names. His daughter hadn't spoken to him since last night. His wife kept compulsively checking the door. A waitress slid his coffee across the counter, eyeing his rumpled shirt. Rough day? The judge stared at his reflection in the black liquid. You could say that. The cop's last card. The prison transport van smelled like sweat and fear. The cop sat shackled between 2 U.S. Marshals, the bullet threat burning in his mind. Through the mesh windows, he caught glimpses of the riots, a police cruiser overturned, a banner reading, "Who protects U.S. from the protectors?" One marshal glanced at him. You're lucky we're moving you tonight. Half the inmates want you dead. The cop's laugh was hollow. Only half? Then the van jerked violently. Boom. An explosion rocked the street. The cop's head slammed against the metal wall as the van skidded sideways. Gunfire erupted outside. The marshals drew their weapons. Stay down. The doors were wrenched open. Not by cops. By masked men with badges still clipped to their belts. The jailbreak. Rough hands dragged the cop into an alley. His vision swam, but he recognized the voice hissing in his ear. Hayes says you're coming with us. It was his old partner's new partner, the same man who'd slipped him the bullet. The cop's stomach dropped. This wasn't a rescue. It was a cleanup. A gun pressed to his ribs. Walk. Or your mom gets a visit before the cancer finishes her. The cop walked. The judge's reckoning. The judge's phone buzzed with an alert, prisoner transport attacked. His blood ran cold. He dialed the prosecutor, who answered on the first ring. We think dirty cops sprung him, the prosecutor said. They're either hiding him or killing him. The judge's fingers tightened around the phone. He thought of the cop's hollow eyes in court, the way he'd flinched at his victims' testimonies. However this ended, the judge realized with sudden clarity, he was responsible too. His wife looked up from her suitcase. Where are you going? The judge grabbed his coat. To finish what I started. The safe house. The cop woke in a concrete basement, his wrists zip-tied to a pipe. Across the room, his rescuers argued in low voices. Bodies gotta disappear tonight, one muttered. The cop's mouth tasted like blood. He'd spent years being the predator. Now he was prey. A shadow fell over him. His old partner's new partner crouched down, smiling. Hayes says thanks for the confession. Pity you'll overdose before trial. He held up a syringe. The cop's mind raced. His mother's face flashed in his memory. Then the judge's. Mercy isn't weakness. With a roar, he yanked, snapping the pipe free, and drove the jagged metal into the man's thigh. The blood trail. The cop stumbled through back alleys, his hands still bound, the syringe clutched in his fist. He needed leverage. He needed. A car screeched to a halt in front of him. The cop braced for gunfire. The window rolled down. The judge stared back. For a heartbeat, they just looked at each other, two broken men in a broken system. Then the judge unlocked the doors. The bargain. The car smelled like old leather and fear. The judge drove without looking at him. Where's Hayes? The cop's laugh was ragged. You think I know? I think, the judge said slowly, you're the only one who can end this. The cop stared at the syringe in his hands, the one meant to kill him. The answer hit like lightning. They'll never stop coming for me, he said. The judge finally met his eyes. Then we make sure you're worth more alive than dead. The broadcast. At 11:17 p.m., every major news network cut to the same image. The cop and the judge, side by side at a press podium. The cop's face was bruised, his knuckles bloody. The judge looked like he hadn't slept in years. The cop leaned into the microphones. Commissioner Hayes ordered my murder tonight. He held up the syringe. This was meant to silence me. Instead, I'm naming every name. The judge stepped forward as cameras flashed. And I'm reopening every case. In a luxury high-rise, Hayes watched the broadcast, and quietly reached for his gun. The midnight air smelled of smoke and impending rain as the judge and the cop stood on the rooftop of the courthouse, staring down at the city in chaos. Sirens wailed in the distance, but up here, there was only silence, and the weight of what came next. The cop's hands shook as he lit a cigarette, the flame trembling in the wind. They'll kill us for this. The judge didn't flinch. Maybe. He turned to face him. But not before we finish it. A phone buzzed, the cop's burner. A single text from an unknown number. You should have taken the bullet. Hayes' last move. Commissioner Hayes wasn't panicking. He was calculating. From his penthouse, he watched the news cycle spiral, his reflection sharp in the floor-to-ceiling windows. His lawyer stood stiffly by the door. Sir, we need to. Hayes silenced him with a raised hand. They have no proof. The lawyer swallowed. The cop has the syringe. The judge has the files. And the FBI just raided the 12th Street construction site. Hayes' jaw tightened. He opened his desk drawer. Inside lay a pistol and a plane ticket to a country with no extradition. He took the gun. The trap. The judge knew they were being watched. He and the cop moved through the courthouse's back corridors, footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The cop kept glancing over his shoulder. He'll come for us himself, the cop muttered. Hayes doesn't trust anyone else to do it clean. The judge slowed at a security door. Then we make sure he walks into the light. He handed the cop a small recorder. You know what to do. The cop stared at it like it was a live grenade. And if this gets me killed? The judge met his gaze. Then at least you die doing one thing right. The confession. The cop stepped into the empty courtroom alone. His footsteps echoed as he walked to the witness stand, the same one where his victims had broken down in tears. Now, it was his turn. He pressed record. My name is, withheld. Badge number, redacted. And for 12 years, I took bribes, planted evidence, and hurt people because I thought I was untouchable. His voice cracked. But the worst thing I ever did was stay silent. He named names. Dates. Payments. Every dirty secret Hayes had ever buried. Then the door creaked open behind him. The standoff. Hayes stood in the doorway, gun half raised. His suit was immaculate. His eyes were dead. "I should have put you down myself years ago," he said. The cop didn't turn around. Kept talking into the recorder. "Commissioner Hayes is here now. Holding a gun. Because he knows it's over." Hayes stepped forward. "You really think this changes anything?" The cop finally turned. "Yeah. I do." Because behind Hayes, the judge stood in the shadows, with every major news camera in the city rolling. The fall. Hayes saw the cameras too late. His face twisted, not in fear, but rage. The gun swung toward the judge. The cop moved without thinking. Bang! The shot echoed. The cop stumbled back, clutching his shoulder, but Hayes was the one who dropped. A sniper's bullet. Federal agents swarmed the room. The judge rushed to the cop's side as blood seeped through his fingers. "Why'd you do that?" The cop grinned weakly. "Guess I owed you one." The aftermath. 3 months later. Hayes' empire crumbled. Dozens of arrests. Millions in dirty money seized. The cop got 15 years, a fraction of his original sentence, for turning state's evidence. The judge resigned, but not before overturning 23 wrongful convictions. The city didn't heal overnight. But the protests faded. The rebuilding began. The last visit. The judge came to the prison on a Tuesday. The cop looked older. Calmer. His orange jumpsuit hung loose where he'd lost weight. "You testifying at Hayes' trial?" he asked. The judge shook his head. "Let the victims do that." He slid a photo across the table, the cop's mother, smiling beside his niece. "She's in remission." The cop's breath hitched. He turned the photo over. On the back, in his mother's handwriting. "Come home when you're ready to be the man I named you after." The judge stood to leave. The cop spoke suddenly. "That day you sentenced me, did you know it'd end like this?" The judge paused at the door. "No. But I hoped." The final scene. Outside the prison, the judge tilted his face to the sun. His phone buzzed, a text from his daughter. "Proud of you, Dad." For the first time in years, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. Somewhere behind the walls, a cop sat on his bunk, staring at a photo, and wondering if redemption was possible after all. And in the city they'd both failed, then fought for, life went on.